Likewise, this is more about home than house. It's about asymmetry. This is a building in Tokyo. It's by Kumiko Maki. It's called the Spiral Building. And I suppose it was the initiation of an interest in asymmetric influences in architecture. We run a little program for the students. This is it. Asymmetry and balanced asymmetry. We've got a couple of, I suppose, opposites. Symmetric and asymmetric. Motive, repose, flux, stable. And I suppose we look for symmetry in things, but in fact, you know, when we kind of move about, most things tend to be asymmetrical. Nature is asymmetrical, very much so, even though we study it and find symmetry within it. And I suppose we need a more complex explanation of symmetry, which I refer to as proportional kind of harmony, and an idea of time, you know, revealed through kind of motion in our environment. You know, we tend to forget about time in terms of asymmetry and the patterns running through nature, and I've tried to put, you know, three kind of motion things in this, you know, about kind of asymmetry and the patterns which kind of come from it. Galileo kind of came up with this complex kind of motion in terms of a butterfly in a boat, you know, kind of, or a fish in a tank, and you view it through a telescope from the shore, and of course you get the kind of waves. So the movement, this motion here, that you can see rotating around the top, kind of changes to a motion that goes like that. And there's often people wonder about what aliens viewing the Earth would kind of see of our kind of movements and our motion. Symmetry permeated Europe, you know, with the Renaissance, and you had a kind of order, a formulation for it. I think they got slightly kind of bored with it, and they invented the Baroque, which kind of lasted for about 500 years, turned into the Rococo, and it became, I suppose, a framework, you know, upon which ornamentation, you know, was kind of produced, which was asymmetric, and there's things do tend like that. The influence, I suppose, of asymmetry, and it's really to do with modernism, you know, where did the asymmetry in modernism come from? And if we kind of look at, I suppose, connections, you did have connections and trade routes running from east to west, and you had the Silk Route. And when it was kind of broken, it was broken when Constantinople fell, which is kind of relevant here, I suppose. And they started to do trade by shipping, so the ships became important, and they kind of made contact with Japan, and they opened up an island called Dejima. And it was the Portuguese who actually did this at that time. And there was also contact with China, you know, at this time, who traded with Japan as well. They kept them on the island because they were very afraid of Christianity. But actually, once a year, they were allowed to go to Edo. And so they went to meet the shogun and kind of pay homage to the shogun. And while they were there, they stayed in places, and they were taken around, and they were shown the gardens, the stroll gardens of Japan, which of course, these stories came back, and they weren't just stories, they were stories from these trading people, the Dutch trading people. And the first reference to it is by William Temple, and he talks about Sherwadi as a kind of fine admirable example, and he talks about this idea of natural kind of beauty, and he talks about it as a Chinese influence, but in fact he actually was a trade envoy, you know, to Holland and the Dutch, and that's actually where it comes from. And the word actually means uneven and irregular in Japanese, and we now know that because there's been some research on it. William Temple actually produced a garden, and you can see just there's a formal garden, and then to one side of it you can kind of see this irregular example, which of course was the first irregular garden kind of built in England, and there are several of these. They're actually still there. They're quite fascinating. That happens to be stone, and this picturesque kind of characteristic permeated kind of England, and it permeated everything, politics, just about everything, you know. And it has particular kind of characteristics to it. It also went into Europe, and it was known as the English garden. It's rough, it's unrefined, it's irregular, it has diagonal spatial organisation and things that go from foreground to background diagonally. It has deep space, hidden kind of areas, you know, the kind of waterways go around, and so you've got things which are hidden. It appears to be unplanned, but is highly organised in terms of diagonal recessions of space. And I suppose there are incidental architectural elements in it. You know, the incidental elements can, of course, be formal, and very many of them were. About 100 years later, you get theory written on it. The gardens appeared a long time before the theory came about. And Gilpin kind of is the first person to write about picturesque kind of theory. And of course, he did a series of sketchbooks and wrote about the sketchbooks, and he kind of organises this, and these are theoretical kind of developments of the picturesque, and it went along with a grand tour, and you went on tour in Europe, and this became part of, I suppose, your passage in life, and it became an interest, you know, and you kind of showed all your sketchbooks, you know, in your house, and that was part of being a middle class or an emerging middle class within England. Some French architects started to study antiquity quite deeply, and they looked at the assemblage of the Parthenon. They found these kind of curved lines, and they found irregularity, and they looked for order within this kind of irregular kind of setup, you know. And it was Choisy who kind of came up with this kind of idea, you know, that actually, you know, you had discrete scenes asymmetrically balanced or ponderated, you know, and in fact he proposed a sequence of control views as one approaches the main feature, creating anticipation and climax through designed kind of transitions. He also said that this happened all over the world with most monuments, and it's actually true. If you kind of look at some of the monuments, you can see that this is a symmetry associated with how we move rather than a symmetry associated with kind of symmetrical things on a plan. You don't get a tie with Japan again, you know, kind of Japan opens up, you know, Kerry kind of went across and forced them to open their borders and trade, and they realised they were so far behind that they actually had to do something. And Perry went there several times before they actually let him in. It's not true, they just went there once. But they had this international kind of exhibition things, and there was a kind of started being an exchange of kind of information. And Europe was flooded with, I suppose, a Japanese influence, and I suppose it was mainly the woodcuts, you know, or woodblock prints, which were the main kind of influence. But you did get Dresser who went over there. He went over there to talk to them how to build their industries. They traded in art, so they traded art objects, and he brought some of them back, and that's where the kind of wabi-sabi kind of aesthetic, you know, started to permeate Europe from. This was quite influential in the arts and crafts, you know, and Milphasius took this aesthetic into Europe, and you get that influence on modernism, which I've been talking about, and the architectural promenade, because Le Corbusier, of course, had read Choisy, and he'd kind of been to the Parthenon and kind of seen what was going on, and that's the asymmetry, and you get these A, B asymmetry of the villa Stein, and also you get, I suppose, Mises' essay as a landscape, so tectonic objects as a kind of landscape, which is, I think, one of the most best examples of landscape in modernism. This just shows some of that, I suppose, aesthetic influence, you know, in terms of Beardsley, you know, and you can see the kind of print and you can see the direct kind of influence and kind of asymmetric positioning. I'm just going to talk about where this irregularity comes from, where this asymmetry comes from in Japan. It comes from nature, you know, and it comes from, I suppose, a Buddhist and Shinto kind of combination. Shinto, of course, is a religion associated with worshipping nature, and it was captured, if you like, by Buddhism when Buddhism kind of arrived in Japan. You've got the Japanese house and home, you know, very much, you know, is the base, you know, of the kind of aesthetic and how it kind of works, and you have this horizontality which merges with kind of nature, and you've got the garden as an integral part of the house, you know, which is also, you know, kind of tied in to an in-between space, which is the engawa, which is the balcony kind of running around it. And I would say that you know, the whole house is kind of empty, and this emptiness prevails, and of course that was very much a distinctive influence on Le Corbusier, the emptiness, and he tended to photograph his buildings, you know, whilst they were empty. Darkness and shadows are really closely linked to that, you know. This is emerges from, I suppose, this Zen Buddhist kind of notion of absolute kind of space, you know, Ri and Ji, you know. So you've got kind of earthly space, you know, which is formed by the propping apart, you know, of heaven and earth, you know, by this fluxating kind of black pillar. And I suppose the space in Japan deliberately kind of empties itself. It can be empty because they have storehouses which are called kura, and they put everything into them, and then they have these tatami mats, and you bring things to the space, so it's kind of action space, and in fact space is kind of dynamic, you know, or considered dynamic. Space is also considered positive, and that I suppose comes from their early kind of dwellings, which were kind of pit dwellings. So if you bring a seat to the space, you bring a table to the space, you bring whatever you want to the space in order to kind of utilise that space. I suppose the sequence of space, you know, moving through space and the flow, you know, through the space, you know, is kind of different as well. And although we say there's this connection with the outside, when you've got the shoji closed, you know, you have actually no connection, and you have no knowledge, you know, of the outside. And you can see how this kind of, you've got this zigzag kind of movement through the building, and of course it could be almost anything, you know, you've got these two kind of diagrams. So you've got this zigzag manner kind of through kind of space, you know, which is typical, you know, of their aesthetic, you know, and this aesthetic emerges from what they call a muja, which is a flux. It's a flux associated with nature, you know, to do with the flow of nature, a phenomena which is associated with that. And I suppose it's to do with change and a slippage between existence and non-existence, you know, and it comes from a Buddhist notion, you know, of kind of beauty. So asymmetry, you know, is part of a kind of incompletion which is associated with this kind of slippage. And this slippage is to do with opposites. So you have two opposites, which, I mean, you could say are kind of earth and heaven, if you like, and the fluxating kind of pillar is the kind of slippage, you know. Or you could kind of look at a garden and you could say, you know, that there are opposites here, you know. We tend to look at the stones, you know, in this garden, rather than actually looking at the kind of raked earth and the patterns of the raked earth, but they're one and the same thing, and opposites, and Japanese people talk about opposites and talk in opposites, and also they actually, their whole kind of setup, you know, is about incompletion. So they will talk in sentences, and they will leave things out of their sentences, and you actually interpret it, and that's considered an art or an art form in its own kind of right. Just as a kind of aside, you know, this is I suppose space, and Japanese for space is kukan, and it kind of means different things, and it's got compounded, I suppose, images. There's an idea of ma, and ma is space. It's this fluctuating space, you know. You can't quite tell where it is. It kind of flows, you know, just like their kind of idea, you know, this kind of natural kind of flow. It involves different interpretations, you know, sky, though not the sky that we know of. You saw the dome before, and that's their idea of kind of sky and space. It's an enclosed space. It comes from a cave, you know, in their former kind of, in terms of language. It has connotations of interval, among, and between. And so the idea of space is actually it's a kind of combination of things, you know, pause, as in pausing to actually kind of enter a space. The idea of society, and all of society, I should say, all of Japanese society together, and this kind of social space. So it has all these kind of other kind of meanings, and very much this discontinuity in terms of pause. If you just kind of look at it as a symbol, and very much that the symbols are related to nature, so you've got kanji, you know, which is directly related to nature, so that the actual symbols actually come from the natural kind of forms.